Let's talk about a serial killer that was actually caught for multiple murders, but then tricked the media and authorities into releasing him early. He then went on to take 11 lives and no one suspected it was him because of how genius his cover story was. And ladies and boxheads, I'm talking about Jack Unterweger. Let me tell you about his past so you really understand how Jack became a serial killer and outsmarted law enforcement. So violence had always been a part of this man's life. Even as a teenager, he was an angry boy who hated women. He would carry around a steel rod ready to threaten or beat up prostitutes and their pimps at any given time. At 24 is when his series of heinous crimes against women started. It was May 13th, 1974. In Salzburg, Austria. The night was cold. Jack Unterweger sat in his car, gripping the wheel, his mind spinning with dark thoughts. He was looking out for his next victim. A woman stood on the side of the road, shivering and waiting for a ride. This woman's name was Daphne. Jack spotted her and drove over. He pulled up, offering a lift to the train station. She accepted. The woman stepped in, completely unaware that she had just stepped foot in the devil's car. The road ahead was deserted and Jack began to drive along. Neither of them said a word. The car was completely silent. Then suddenly, the tires spun in the mud. The car was stuck. I'll get us out, Jack muttered. But he actually had no plans of doing that. Instead of getting out to inspect the problem, he started to look at her strangely, as if he was sizing her up. Daphne had a bad feeling about this. She reached for the door handle. Jack hit her over the head. Her head started to spin and her vision blurred. Before she could scream, he was on her, tying her hands behind her back in an intricate knot. One hand, then the other, then binding them together. A signature method, his signature. Daphne struggled, but Jack shoved her back into the car. He crushed her with his own weight and held her down. She felt something cold and hard against her skin. It was a steel rod. Jack was running it over her body. Her face went white. In one quick movement, Jack ripped her clothes off with one hand. Then, ladies and boxheads, he began to touch her inappropriately with the rod. And with his other hand, this disgusting monster began to pleasure himself. This sick man was enjoying watching her get violated. When he was done, he leaned in close. "You're not gonna tell anyone, are you?" he whispered into her ear. She shook her head, too terrified to say a word. But fate had other plans. A car approached. A stranger pulled alongside them and asked if she needed help. Daphne bolted. She threw herself into the Good Samaritan's car and screamed, "Drive now!" Jack watched as she disappeared down the road. It didn't take long after this incident for Jack to be arrested and thrown into jail. There had been a witness, clear evidence of assault. The case was clear-cut. He was guilty. This was to be Jack's first time behind bars. It took him just a few days to come up with a psychotic plan to get himself out of his cell, into a more comfortable situation. And so he hatched a plan for his escape. He quickly figured out which inmate in the prison did what, and found a guy to help him smuggle in a whole jar of painkillers. Then he began to swallow them. 1, 2, 3, 4. He kept taking them. It had to look like a suicide attempt to the guards. His vision blurred and he finally passed out. When the prisoners found him, he was quickly moved to a psychiatric facility where he was deemed not fit for a regular prison. He had just convinced the justice system that he was mentally unstable, with no one knowing that he had set up his suicide attempt to escape prison. So just a few months later, this monster was released back into the world, where he would continue to trick the cops and everyone around. He didn't even last a full year before committing another crime. Except this time, he wasn't just gonna leave the person alive to turn him in. Also, he went in with the knowledge that he could get himself out of trouble if the cops caught him. Yeah, let me tell you about December 11th, 1974 in Germany. Jack and his then girlfriend Barbara were on the road, heading to her parents' house. They were gonna steal some cash. That was the plan. But when they arrived, the house was locked and her parents were asleep. Jack slammed his fist against the door. He was not happy. they needed a new plan. Just then, he spotted a young girl across the road. He got a twisted look in his eyes. "Let's rob someone," he said to Barbara as if it was the most natural thing in the world. And Barbara didn't argue. She never did, really. She was a really quiet girl. That's when they turned their attention to their unfortunate victim, Margaret Schaefer, 18 years old, Barbara's neighbor. She was walking towards her house when Barbara called out to her and asked if she just wanted to hang out. Margaret hesitated, and rightfully so. These two women weren't friends. But Margaret was also an 18-year-old teenager, so it didn't take much for Barbara to convince her with a super cool late-night drive. And so she climbed into Jack's car. But this one decision would cost her her life. Jack drove to a secluded spot near a bar. Then, "Get in the front." Margaret barely had any time to react before Jack grabbed her, yanking her forward, binding her wrists in his signature knot. And Barbara watched in silence. Jack went through Margaret's purse. There was just some pocket change, not enough. "You have more money at home?" Margaret nodded, shaking. Jack drove back to her house. Barbara went inside using Margaret's key. She took cash, clothes, and some snacks. But Jack wanted more. Margaret started to scream as he drove deep into the woods. Then he stopped the car and pushed her out. Snow crunched beneath their feet as he ordered her to remove her clothes. Barbara stayed in the car. Jack stood over Margaret, watching her tremble in the freezing air. He savored the moment. Then methodically, he raised the steel rod and brought it down on her. Margaret collapsed. Blood stained the snow. But this monster wasn't done. He picked up her bra and then wrapped it around her neck and squeezed. She started to grab at him to fight her way out, but there was no point. He was too strong. Jack choked her until he watched the light disappear from her eyes. Once she finally fell limp, he let her go, kicked her dead body to the side, and got back into the car. Then, just like that, he drove away, leaving her lifeless body in the icy forest. They tossed the steel rod and dumped her clothes, but they kept her fur coat. Margaret's body laid in the woods for 3 weeks before hunters accidentally found the horrific scene. No one could figure out who did this until they finally caught Jack. Well, kind of. A little over a month later, Barbara was arrested for an unrelated crime. The police ran a routine check on her boyfriend, Jack Unterweger. He turned out to have a record of violence against women, like I stated in the beginning of the video. The cops started questioning Barbara about him. Did he ever hit her? Did she see him hit someone else? At first, she refused to say anything, but eventually her guilt got the best of her and she cracked. "Jack killed my neighbor Margaret." The man had a record, so they believed her immediately. Jack was arrested, and under interrogation, he openly admitted that he'd done it. He claimed it was a fit of rage and that he saw his own mother's face when he killed her. A psychiatrist evaluated him and came up with a whole list of problems. Jack was egocentric, aggressive, sadistic, unpredictable, and most importantly, ladies and boxheads, incurable. The court agreed, so on June 1st, 1976, Jack Unterweger was sentenced to life in prison. And man, prison should have been the end of his story, but instead it was just the beginning of his longest con, where he would go on to deceive the public and the justice system for years, until he was finally released. Yeah, you heard me right, let's talk about it. So Jack had never been really educated before, but now he had time, and a lot of it. He spent hours in the library teaching himself to read and write. He earned his diploma, then he started writing stories of his own, and boy were they dark. Somehow he got published. He wrote for a children's radio show called The Bedtime Program for Little Ones. From there, he gained the confidence to write an autobiography. This was the masterpiece that would change everything. Fege Forua. I hope I pronounced that right, or Purgatory, he called it. The book became an instant bestseller. Critics called it raw and powerful. See, if I was a different man, I could make a very, very terrible joke right here, but I'm more mature than that. Anyways, suddenly Jack Unterweger wasn't a murderer or a serial killer. He was now a misunderstood artist, a man that was completely transformed. The media ate it up. Writers, artists, journals, even politicians started protesting for his release. They didn't just want this man freed, they wanted him pardoned. Austrian authorities saw this whole thing as an opportunity, a shining example of prison reform. He went in a killer and came out a beautiful poet. I mean, can you really write a story better than that? I don't know. No one questioned what actual rehabilitation he had received. No one asked if he had undergone therapy, or get this, ladies and boxheads, if he had even been treated for his violent urges. Because we'll later find out the truth is that he hadn't. But it didn't matter, the myth of Jack Unterweger had been crafted. He was the great Austrian redemption story. On May 23rd, 1990, after serving just 15 years, Jack Unterweger was released from prison. The authorities were so proud of their success story, they plastered his release all over the news. But in their excitement, they completely neglected to actually assess whether Jack was fit to be released back into the world. He was given no parole officer, no psychiatric check-ins. He was just a free man. I mean, seriously, me and him have the same rights. But he was a free man with the same thirst for violence. And like you would expect, he was ready to murder again. Within just a few months, Jack had successfully made his way into the world of journalism. And what do you think he was writing about? He was writing about specifically investigative reporting. He moved freely through the red light districts, questioning prostitutes, interviewing police officers, and writing articles that painted him as a concerned citizen. Then an opportunity presented itself. He was assigned to travel to Los Angeles to compare prostitution in America with Europe. June 11th, 1991. Jack landed at Los Angeles International Airport eager for the hunt. He checked into the infamous Cecil Hotel, a building with a dark history of crime and death. And if you've been paying attention to this video, it was his kind of place. Jack wasted no time. He made friends with local police officers to the point where they were taking him on ride-alongs in LA's rougher districts, thinking he might want to report on them. The officers had no idea they were escorting a serial killer as they patrolled the streets. Then, ladies and boxheads, the killings began. 35-year-old Shannon Exley disappeared first. She had been working near the Cecil Hotel when she got into a car with a charming foreigner. 3 days later, her body was found. She had been beaten, assaulted with a tree branch, and strangled with her own bra. Her hands were tied behind her back in the same meticulous knot that Jack had perfected. This is Unit 45, we have a DB. Repeat, we have a DB. Next was 33-year-old Irene Rodriguez, followed by 26-year-old Peggy Jean Booth. Each victim was found bound, strangled, and abandoned like trash. The LAPD suspected they had a serial killer on their hands, but they had no idea he was already inside their ranks, playing the role of an investigative journalist. Jack Unterweger was working right by their side, reporting the very same crime he had committed and making sure he controlled the public narrative about it. Meanwhile, across the world, authorities in Austria were linking the murders back home to Jack. A retired police officer named August Shaner had long suspected Jack of an earlier unsolved murder in Salzburg and contacted Vienna investigators. Brrring. Yes, I know this man, I know how he kills, and I think he's doing it again. Back in Vienna, Chief Max Edelbacher was starting to connect the dots. He realized that Jack had been present in nearly every city where the prostitutes had disappeared. But Jack was one step ahead. When he got wind of the investigation, he walked right into the police station to provide an alibi. His main defense was that he had been with his young girlfriend Katrina on March 7th, 1999, the night that one of the victims disappeared. But Katrina had brought her personal planner to the interview, and flipping through the pages, she quickly disproved Jack's lie. She says, "Wait, I wasn't with Jack that night, I was at a social event, and he was supposed to be in Graz doing a reading." The case was blown wide open. The courts in Graz issued an arrest warrant for Jack on suspicion of murder, but there was someone who leaked the news before authorities could get him into custody. Jack was on the run. Investigators took this opportunity to search his apartment. They found a shotgun, handcuffs, a switchblade, and most incriminating of all, his financial records. Because Jack had received government subsidies for his writing, he kept detailed receipts of all of his expenses. Gas receipts, hotel stays, they showed that Jack had been in the exact locations where the woman had disappeared. All the exact times they vanished. But Jack was gone. Authorities suspected he fled to Switzerland or Italy, but he was nowhere to be found. Then on February 20th, he called the media, and he's playing the victim. "I'm innocent, the police are framing me, it's a witch hunt." His voice was calm, almost too confident. Over the next few days, the media turned the case into a spectacle, questioning whether Jack was truly guilty. But what no one could deny was this: since Jack had disappeared, the killings had stopped. February 15th, 1992. Jack arrived in Switzerland and convinced his girlfriend Bianca to run with him. He made up a mumbo-jumbo narrative about a corrupt cop in Salzburg framing him for murder. Flight 173 to New York, boarding now. Jack and Bianca made their way to New York City. But they weren't just gonna stop there. Jack Unterweger was on the run. He booked another flight and soon they were at their final destination in Miami. Just like me, broke and desperate. Come on, man, hit the subscribe button. They had just $1,200 to their names. But Jack had always been good at surviving. He found them a one-bedroom apartment for only $315 a month. The landlord wasn't too picky, they just wanted 2 months of rent up front. So ladies and boxheads, they made it happen. Then Bianca hit up a local club and landed a gig as a go-go dancer, probably getting paid in cash tips since they weren't US citizens. But Jack had gotten used to being the hero by now. He wasn't just gonna keep living like this, hiding like a rat, living paycheck to paycheck. He came up with a plan to get his ass out of this mess. On one fine day, Jack picks out a payphone on a specifically busy Miami street and walks towards it. He picks up the receiver and dials someone from the Austrian media. A few moments later, he's live on Austrian media, and he's got a complaint. It's the same story all over again. He paints himself as a victim, claiming that the authorities are once again punishing him for his record. 7 minutes go by, and that's long enough for the Austrian authorities to trace his call. But Jack, he knows this. As he hangs up, he takes a deep breath and glances around. He's just one man in a city of hundreds of thousands of people. How are they ever gonna find him? Jack felt untouchable. What he didn't anticipate, however, was his biggest threat wasn't even law enforcement. It was once again his own girlfriend. Back at their cramped one-bedroom apartment, Bianca sat on the bed, flipping through a newspaper. A story about her flashed across the page, claiming that friends and family feared she was in danger. Guilt twisted in her stomach. "I have to call my mother," she firmly said. Jack's expression darkened. That's not a good idea. His tone was calm, but his eyes were sharp. Bianca ignored. She later slipped out of the house, found a phone booth, and made the call. "Mama, I'm okay," she whispered quickly. Click, call cut off. She wasn't sure if it was bad connection or something scarier, but she had gotten her message across. And with that, she had just allowed the police to trace her location. Meanwhile, back in Austria, a journalist named Elizabeth was still under Jack's spell, thinking he's an innocent man being unfairly punished by the authorities. She had been sending his funky ass money and his thyroid medication, but she was running low on funds, so she turned to her boss, Gert Schmidt, for help. He agreed to wire Jack $10,000. In exchange, he wanted an exclusive interview about life on the run. Jack was thrilled. He had plans, big plans. A new life, a new car, a fresh start. But what he didn't know was that Gert had never trusted him in the first place. The journalist met with Austrian investigators on February 26th, handing over a crucial piece of paper. USA Money Exchange, 207 11th Street, Miami Beach. That right there, ladies and boxheads, is where Jack was picking up the money. There was no time to involve Interpol. US Marshals had to act fast. 4 agents staked out the location, scanning the crowded Miami streets. At exactly 11 a.m., Jack and Bianca walked toward the exchange. Jack spotted the agents immediately, but he didn't change his course. Cool and collected, he leaned against a wall while Bianca went inside to retrieve the money. The marshals took their positions as Bianca came back out and handed Jack the envelope. They started walking away, but then Jack bolted into an alley. One of the marshals took off after him. Jack ran through the narrow streets, but he wasn't fast enough. The officer slammed Jack to the ground, twisting his arms behind his back. "You're done, Unterweger." The marshal snapped the handcuffs shut. Bianca, wide-eyed and shaking, was also taken into custody. Their apartment was searched, but nothing concrete was found, so she was released. She called her mother and barely got a word out before her mother cut her off. "Good, now come home." The next day, Bianca boarded a plane back to Austria, convinced of Jack's innocence. Jack, however, had bigger problems. He faced a hearing in the US. California authorities considered keeping him to stand trial for the 3 Los Angeles prostitute murders. If convicted, he could receive the death penalty. Jack claimed that from his holding cell in Miami's Metropolitan Correctional Center, he could see the electric chair. Of course, there's no way to know if that was true, but Jack loved dramatic stories. Scared that in America he might receive a death penalty, he waived his right to fight extradition and agreed to return to Austria. On a cold March morning, Jack Unterweger stepped onto Austria's soil once again. But he was not a celebrated writer anymore. This time, he was a hunted man. Down in Austria, Jack kept insisting he was innocent. He showed a hotel receipt to prove that he was there when Brunhilde Messar disappeared on October 26th. But the investigators weren't buying it at all. When they checked the hotel records again, they found out that Jack had paid for the room on the 26th and the 27th, but he hadn't actually checked in until the 27th. Dun dun dun. This meant that he could have easily been in Graz the night before, where Brunhilde went missing. Since it was less than 2 hours away, Jack didn't seem too bothered. He tried using his girlfriend at the time, Catherine, as an alibi once more, even though the investigators had already proven that he was lying about that. During his trial, his lies were starting to fall apart. He had claimed he was on the phone with a woman named Karen when Sylvia Zagler disappeared. At first, Karen didn't remember the date, but by the time she was on the witness stand, she was suddenly sure it was the evening of April 8th. The prosecutor raised an eyebrow. "And how are you so sure?" he asked her. To which Karen answers, "Because I meditated on it." "Oh, well, that solves it." But the prosecution wasn't done. They brought out a letter Karen had sent Jack while he was in prison. In it, she basically asked him what to say to help him out. Busted! And Karen wasn't the only one whose story fell apart. Another woman Jack had claimed to be with the night of a different disappearance couldn't even remember which night it was. On top of all of that, forensic experts found fibers on one of the victims that matched a scarf and pants in Jack's closet. Traces of blood under another victim's fingernails turned out to be type B. And ladies and box heads, could you guess it? Jack's blood type. But the biggest shock came when they found a single blonde hair in Jack's car. DNA testing confirmed it was Bianca Bekova's hair. Now, this didn't prove anything beyond the fact that Bianca had been in his car. But if it was all so innocent, why had Jack been so hell-bent on saying she had never been in his car? That lie made the evidence even more suspicious. The trial ended with Jack being found guilty on 9 out of 11 murder charges. The body of 2 victims had decomposed so much that they couldn't convict with certainty. Jack stood there cocky as ever. He smirked and said he'd appeal, but that appeal never came. Because the next day, Jack was found dead in his cell. He had used a shoelace and a string from his pants to hang himself. The craziest thing is, Jack had tied his noose with the exact same knot he had used to strangle all of his victims. Now let's talk about Andrew Cunanan. On July 15th of 1997, every media outlet was thrown into chaos with the news of Gianni Versace's sudden death. Every headline read the same thing. Gianni Versace, shot dead on the steps of his Miami mansion in broad daylight. And who killed him? It was a mastermind by the name of Andrew Cunanan. This is the story of the infamous Versace killer. Andrew Cunanan was born on August 31st, 1969 in National City, California. He grew up a really smart and sordid kid. On paper, the Cunanan household looked like a dream. They lived in the rich neighborhood of Rancho Bernardo, surrounded by tennis courts and manicured lawns. The kind of place where kids ride bikes and families wave from porches. Andrew was the golden child, his dad's favorite out of 4 children. It was Andrew, his 2 sisters, sisters and his brother, but he was the only one who stood out, always. Everyone knew he was going to do big things because he was smart. He had an IQ of 142, only 18 points down from Einstein, which means he can officially be labeled a genius. As if that wasn't enough, he was also really popular at school. He was the most fun guy to be around. He once showed up to a formal event in a tight red leather jumpsuit. Everyone else was in a suit and tie. Not Andrew. He looked like he had crash landed from another planet and loved the attention. He was named most likely never to be forgotten in the yearbook, and clearly, ladies and boxheads, they nailed it with that one. In all the ways that mattered, he was perfect. And unfortunately, because he received so much attention for it, he became obsessed with appearing perfect. But he had a secret that was eating him up on the inside. He was gay, and he could never tell his family. Not because they wouldn't have accepted him, they probably would have, but because he couldn't bear not being completely perfect. He had to keep up the Golden Boy Act, and it was an act that slowly started to drive him crazy. There's a report that in 1996, Andrew called a hotline for sexual violence survivors. He claimed he'd been treated inappropriately by a priest as a child, back when he was an altar boy. This should tell you that this young man was dealing with a lot of dark and sinister trauma underneath the surface. And it will start to come to the surface in the most messed up ways. Let's fast forward to age 19. Andrew's on top of the world. He's handsome, fluent in French, knows how to tell a good bottle of wine from a bad one, and can hold an intellectual conversation on philosophy, history, and politics. He is extremely well-spoken, the kind of guy who could charm a senator and a movie star in the same evening. On paper, he is perfect. But then, suddenly, his perfect life comes crashing down. His father, his hero, is caught embezzling money. And just like that, the fairy tale ends. Rather than face charges, his dad exits the country, fleeing to the Philippines and leaving the family broke and humiliated. Andrew decides to follow him and confront him. So he takes a flight out to the Philippines, only to find the man he idolized living in dirt, broke, powerless, and a fraud. Andrew realizes his whole life was a lie. The Golden Boy mask started to slip. He came back to the States angry, disappointed, and changed. He fought with his mother and shoved her so hard she slammed into a wall. Her shoulder was dislocated. Andrew was stressed out about the future. It was time to use his brain and look for the quickest way up the ladder, where he could both make money and rub shoulders with the elite in society. He dropped out of college and then abandoned his family. He moved to San Francisco and started working as a gigolo. And I don't mean back alley stuff, he had a client list. He wasn't just going to sleep with anyone, he was too good for that. He fraternized with rich, older men in penthouses. Men who bought him Rolexes and paid his rent just to keep him around. And Andrew, don't forget, he was an extremely handsome guy and he was very smart and cultured. He played the role of a high-end escort perfectly. Elegant, seductive, sophisticated. He didn't just sleep with these men, he studied them, copied them, learned how the rich moved, talked, and dressed. And it helped that he was already so well-read. Slowly, he climbed up the ladder. He started hanging out with celebrities, or at least claiming he did. Madonna, John Travolta, Tom Cruise, Leonardo DiCaprio. He told anyone who'd listen that he was part of their inner circles. Was any of it true? Who knows? But Andrew had something better than truth. He was a smooth talker. He could make people believe everything he said. He even claimed to have met Gianni Versace. He said they crossed paths at a club or a party in San Francisco. Maybe it was just for a few minutes, maybe more. That's where Andrew's obsession began. With fame, with beauty, with power. He wanted what these people had. Police would later find a little black book in his belongings. Guess who was in it? Versace, Madonna, Cruise, Travolta, DiCaprio. He had notes, addresses, phone numbers. Whether it was real or fantasy didn't matter. It was a kill list. And Versace? He was right at the top, but we're not there yet. So there he was, partying through San Francisco, secretly broke and desperate. And still pretending he wasn't, Andrew Cunanan, the golden boy of San Francisco's nightlife, reduced to charging $140 a night for companionship. But even then, he'd strut out of some $1,000 dinner and slap down a $200 tip like he was a millionaire. He wanted his friends to think he was the shit, because that's what it was all about. Applause, admiration. He wanted to be the main character in everyone's story. And in his world, money was the script, but the applause was fake. The affection was shallow, and the loneliness, that part was all too real. By 1996, he was living large again. A retired art dealer let him stay in his mansion, gave him $2,000 a month, and handed him the keys to a flashy sports car. Andrew looked like he had it all, but as always, it was borrowed time. The relationship ended, the money stopped coming, the car was taken back. And Andrew, he was sinking fast. Somewhere in that chaos, two names became central to his story: David Madsen and Jeffrey Trail. David Madsen was everything Andrew idolized: young, brilliant, successful. A Minneapolis architect with a bright future and killer looks. He was Andrew's lover. Jeffrey Trail, on the other hand, was Andrew's best friend, an ex-Navy guy who had Andrew's back for years. These two weren't just clients to Andrew. These were people he cared about. Or at least thought he did. Eventually, David ended things when he realized Andrew was sleeping around. He wanted something real, but Andrew wanted a taste of everything. As for Jeffrey, he too started pulling away. Maybe he saw through the lies. Maybe he was just done. But the moment they stepped out of Andrew's circle, he started to see them as threats. To make things worse, David and Jeffrey had both ended up living in Minnesota, just miles from each other. And when they became friends, that was it. The final blow. Andrew wasn't just losing people, he was being replaced. He was now lonelier than ever. So he finally snapped. Andrew phoned David, said he was coming to visit. It was a statement, not a request. And despite everything, David said okay. On April 25th, 1997, Andrew arrived in Minneapolis. He was broke, maxed out his credit cards, desperate to get back what he'd lost. He even brought a fancy watch, a gift for David, like some twisted peace offering. But David wasn't fooled. Andrew was acting strange, unsettled. That same weekend, Andrew left a message for Jeffrey inviting him over to David's place. It would be the last message Jeffrey Trail ever received. When Jeffrey arrived, he didn't know he had just walked into a trap. No one knows what words were said or how it led up to this. All we know is what came next. Jeffrey was beaten with a claw hammer again and again. Around 30 blows to the head. Brutal, relentless. Days later, the building superintendent was asked to check on the apartment after David failed to show up to work. There was a dog scratching at the door, and inside, Jeffrey's body rolled up in a rug. But David was gone. At first, police believed Andrew had forced David to flee with him. Maybe he was terrified, maybe he was trying to stay alive. For 2 days, no one knew what had happened. And then, David Madsen was found dead by the shore of Rush Lake. Shot in the back, then again through the eye. Execution style. The two people Andrew claimed to love most were gone. If he couldn't have them, no one could have them. And he was just getting started. 1 week later in Chicago, real estate mogul Lee Miglin's wife came home to find her garage door open. What she found inside was a nightmare. Lee Miglin had been known to have partied and slept with all sorts of celebrities and gigolos. Now the man lay mangled on the floor. His ribs were shattered. He'd been stabbed over 20 times with a screwdriver. His throat had been sawed nearly clean through, and there were pruning shears jammed into his chest. A plastic bag had been placed over his face, with holes poked in the nostrils. It was like Andrew wanted him alive just a little longer. The brutality was off the charts, but then the wife realized something even more horrifying. After committing all this brutality, Andrew had gone into one of the bathrooms and shaved. Then he made a sandwich. Then he calmly took Miglin's green Lexus and drove off. That car would take him to his next target. Days later in Pennsville, New Jersey, the caretaker of a cemetery was found dead. William Reese. Shot in the head, that was it. No mutilation, no rage. Just a clean, efficient kill. Why him? No connection, no grudge. Just a car. Andrew needed a new vehicle and William Reese had one. The FBI called it a functional murder. Andrew had now killed 4 men. His best friend, his ex-lover, a wealthy stranger, and an innocent man in the wrong place at the wrong time. And he was heading south. To Miami. The FBI knew exactly who they were looking for. It was now just a matter of finding him. By now, Andrew Cunanan's face was plastered everywhere. TV, newspapers, post offices. 12 different people claimed they'd seen him in Miami. But somehow, the authorities moved like they were sleepwalking. While the manhunt stumbled, Andrew waited. In a crappy Miami hotel room, he was plotting the grand finale. This time, it was his idol, the legendary Gianni Versace. Versace was a giant. Untouchable, always surrounded, always on the move. But on the morning of July 15th, 1997, something changed. The fashion mogul decided to go out alone. Blue skies, palm trees swaying, just a short stroll. For once, he'd grabbed the morning papers himself. He made it back to the front steps of his mansion, calm, casual, arms full of newsprint. That's when Andrew struck. Bang! A bullet tore through Versace's cheek. Bang! Another ripped through the back of his head. The fashion world's brightest star was dead. And just like that, Andrew ran away. He disappeared again into a houseboat where 8 days later, he shot himself. This next story is an English serial killer who took the lives of 8 women in his infamous apartment at 10 Rillington Place and hid their bodies in his walls. Let me take you back to 1899, Halifax, Yorkshire. That's where it started. That's where John Reginald Christie was born, into a loveless home where there was little to no conversation. His father, cold as ice. His mother, overbearing as hell. Christie spends his childhood in fear of his parents. He learns early how to stay quiet and how to lie to stay out of trouble. This is what helps him become a master manipulator later in life. But we're not there yet. Even as a kid, something wasn't right. He would casually torture animals, steal from neighbors, sneak around like a ghost. But back then, they chalked it up to boys being boys. Nobody saw the darkness brewing inside him. Then came World War I. And if John was broken before, the war shattered what was left. A mustard gas attack left him partially mute for a while, but it also gave him a new tool to manipulate people with: pity. People let their guard down around him, and Christie learned how to use that. By the time the 1930s rolled around, he was married to a woman named Ethel and living a quiet life in London. They ended up at a little place in Notting Hill, 10 Rillington Place. Just another crumbling townhouse on a tired little street. No one thought twice about the soft-spoken man in flat number 1. But behind those walls, something was happening. Something twisted. The women he targeted were never chosen at random. They were picked carefully, vulnerable in just the right way. Some were sex workers trying to survive in post-war London with barely a coin to their name. Others were young women looking for work, food, or a warm bed for the night. There were those who came to him for help, women with nowhere else to turn, desperate for a solution. Whether it was an unwanted pregnancy, an illness, or just a bit of kindness, Christie always had the same answer: come inside. I can help you. He'd pose as a doctor, or at least someone with medical experience, dropping fancy-sounding phrases and referencing his supposed knowledge from the war. He kept bottles of pills around to sell the illusion, and he had that soft voice, that gentle tone that made people feel safe. That's what made him so effective. They let their guard down, they believed him, and then the door would shut. The gas would start to hiss. Christie had rewired the gas taps in his kitchen so he could use the gas to knock his victims out cold, then strangle them. It was always the same playbook. He kept their bodies, sometimes for days, hidden in nooks and floorboards inside his apartment like he was collecting them. He enjoyed the control he had over women, the fantasy, the power. Where was his wife in all of this? Well, they say she knew exactly what was going on, but like most women around that time, she didn't have anywhere to go, so she stayed quiet and out of Christie's business. For a while, no one else was aware of what Christie was doing. Then a man named Timothy Evans moved in upstairs. Now, this is where the story turns from horrific to tragic. Timothy wasn't the sharpest tool in the shed. He struggled to read. He worked odd jobs. He told tall tales to make himself sound important. But really, he was just a kid in a man's body, trying to survive in a city that didn't care. Then there was John Christie, who was downstairs. He seemed helpful, calm, soft-spoken, the kind of man you'd trust with your secrets. The kind of man who offered cups of tea and said things like, "Let me know if you ever need anything." Timothy and Beryl took him at his word. They had no idea what kind of monster they were living above. In 1949, Beryl found out she was pregnant again, but there was no money and no way to raise another child. Abortion was illegal, dangerous. Desperate, the couple didn't know where to turn. That's when Christie made his move. He told Beryl he could help and that he'd learned medical techniques during the war. Said he'd performed procedures before. That he could terminate the pregnancy safely. Just trust him. Timothy was nervous, but Christie was so calm, so sure of himself. He talked like a doctor, used big words, made it all sound easy. So eventually, with nowhere else to turn, they agreed. November 8th, 1949. That was the day. Timothy left for work that morning. Beryl stayed behind and Christie got to work. But there was no procedure. Christie gassed Beryl in his kitchen using a homemade rubber tube hooked up to the wall tap. Once she was unconscious, he strangled her with a piece of rope, just like the others. Then he wrapped her body in a blanket and hid it in a little cupboard under the sink. Baby Geraldine was still alive. She was crying, alone, and wondering where her mother went. And Christie couldn't leave witnesses, so he strangled the child too, a baby, barely over a year old. And once again, he cleaned up, wiped the kitchen, acted normal, like nothing had happened. Meanwhile, Timothy came home to find Beryl and the baby missing. Christie gave him this story. He said the abortion had gone wrong and unfortunately Beryl had died. He said that he'd disposed of her body and that the baby had been taken in by someone who could care for her. Timothy was in shock. He didn't understand how someone could be so nonchalant about this. He wanted to tell someone, but Christie told him not to. He warned him that he'd go to prison, that no one would believe him. So Timothy left town, but guilt caught up with him. He went to the police a few weeks later, confused, panicked, and rambling. His story changed with each telling. Sometimes he said Beryl took pills. Sometimes he blamed someone else. He didn't know what to say because he didn't know what had really happened. The police latched onto it. They had a body, they had a confession, that was all they needed. They raided Christie's house and found Beryl's body stuffed under the sink. Then they found baby Geraldine, strangled, laid out in a wash house. At trial, Christie took the stand. He was calm because he knew exactly how little evidence the police had linking the murder to him. He used his charisma and manipulation tactics to his advantage, and convinced the court that Timothy was the one who killed his wife. And in 1950, Timothy Evans was hanged, an innocent man, executed for Christie's crimes. 3 more years would pass. Christie kept on killing. He murdered his own wife Ethel in 1952, and as always hid her under the floorboards as well. Then he invited more women into his flat. More lies, more gas, more death. Until March 1953. That's when the landlord showed up to do some work and ripped open a panel in the kitchen wall. Thud. A body wrapped in blankets slid out. The police were called immediately. The whole building was searched. They found more corpses in the walls, under the floorboards, in the garden. It was a house of horrors. And John Christie was gone. He vanished into the city. 10 days later, they found him sitting on a bench near Putney Bridge, pockets stuffed with clippings about his crimes. He didn't even fight. He didn't deny it. He just confessed. At trial, the nation watched in horror as the truth came out. 8 murders, maybe more. The wrongful execution of Timothy Evans, and a justice system that had failed in every possible way. In July 1953, John Christie was hanged at Pentonville Prison, the same place they'd killed Evans 3 years earlier. But the public weren't satisfied, so by the late 1960s, executions were abolished because of Christie. And then Rillington Place was torn down. If you enjoyed today's video and want to hear about more killers, click this video on the screen.